December 7, 1944, Camp Hearn, Texas. The gates of the prison camp swung open, and a convoy of trucks rolled in through the rising dust. The German prisoners, who had been mending fences and cleaning tools, stopped in their tracks. Their eyes lifted, and then froze. From the trucks stepped a group of American women. They wore khaki trousers and rolled-up sleeves, hair tied back with bright scarves. Clipboards in hand, they walked with a calm, effortless authority that seemed to command the entire yard. The men behind the barbed wire stared as if they had seen something unreal, something their world had never allowed them to imagine. One woman jumped down from a truck bed and began directing soldiers as they unloaded Red Cross crates. Her voice was clear, confident, and without hesitation. Another leaned against the wheel, laughing with a guard who was twice her size. They moved as though they belonged in every space of this war machine, not as assistants but as leaders. To the German POWs, this scene tore through years of propaganda in a single moment. Back in Europe, they had been told that American women were weak, spoiled, and lost in decadence. But what they saw now, these women who drove trucks, organized supplies, and issued orders to men, was something entirely different. They were not the background of a nation. They were part of its power. Near the fence, an Afrika Korps officer watched silently. The sun flashed off his thin wire glasses as he muttered something under his breath. Half disbelief, half admiration. His comrades said nothing. Every man in that camp, from tank crewmen to Luftwaffe mechanics, stood quietly watching those women command the space with a discipline and confidence that felt more powerful than any weapon they had seen. The Americans didn't need to boast about victory. They lived inside it. Even here, in a camp filled with the defeated, their laughter, their freedom, and their abundance were like invisible banners of triumph. Cigarette smoke drifted over the wire. A radio hummed somewhere in the distance. A train whistle echoed from the horizon where another shipment of war material was likely on its way to a port. By the time the women finished unloading and prepared to leave, silence had returned to the yard. The trucks rolled out of the gate, engines growling softly, wheels kicking up the dry Texas dust. The German prisoners lingered by the fence, watching until the last hint of color faded down the dirt road. One man spoke softly, his voice flat and distant. "If our nation had women like that," he said, "perhaps we wouldn't have lost." Another shook his head, not in disagreement, but in quiet understanding. They had once believed that victory came from discipline and fear, but what they saw that morning was another kind of strength entirely, the kind that grew from confidence, equality, and the belief that no one, not even a nation at war, could suppress the will to live freely. December 20th, 1944, Central Texas. The morning began with the deep rumble of engines and the metallic clang of truck doors slamming shut. A convoy was forming outside Camp Hearn, bound for the nearby town of Bryan. Several dozen German prisoners were being transported under guard to assist in farm labor and warehouse work, part of America's policy to keep the captured soldiers productive. The men climbed into the open trucks, chains clinking softly against the wooden benches. The December air bit at their faces, but none of them spoke much. The memory of that first encounter, the American women at the camp, still hung in their minds like an echo they couldn't shake. Many of them, raised in a world where women were rarely seen outside kitchens or hospitals, had spent sleepless nights wondering if what they saw was a dream. As the convoy rolled through the countryside, the prisoners stared out across the open land. America seemed endless, fields stretching to the horizon, barns painted bright red, roads carved neatly into the soil. Even the smallest towns looked organized, alive, and growing. It didn't look like a country at war. It looked like a nation accelerating. When they arrived in Bryan, the air smelled of fresh oil, gasoline, and wheat. The guards unloaded them near a large grain warehouse. On the far side of the yard, a group of women were already at work, loading sacks. writing inventory sheets and driving forklifts with steady precision. The POWs stood still again, struck by the same disbelief that had silenced them days before. One of the women, her uniform marked, Wexler stepped down from a truck and handed a clipboard to an American sergeant. Her movements were quick and professional, her tone brisk. The German prisoners watched as she lit a cigarette, tucked it between her lips, and continued giving orders while the men worked around her. There was no hesitation, no need to prove anything. It was ordinary. It was routine. To the Germans, it was unimaginable. Back home, their women had been rationing bread, digging through ruins, writing letters to ghosts. Here, women operated machinery, drove freight trucks, and commanded respect in a country that had somehow turned war into an organized system of progress. As the day went on, some of the POWs worked alongside the women, shoveling grain, moving crates, stacking boxes. Conversation was forbidden, but glances and gestures passed between them. One woman, perhaps 25, handed a German prisoner a wrench to fix a jammed conveyor. Their hands brushed. She smiled politely before turning away. For the prisoner, that fleeting human moment felt more disarming than any American bomb. By noon, the sun was high and the work relentless. Yet everything ran with efficiency. The machines roared. The trucks cycled in and out, and the women kept pace without slowing. The German soldiers began to sense that this was the real weapon of America, not just its factories or tanks, but its people. Every citizen seemed to carry the same purpose, the same quiet determination. When the trucks took them back to the camp that evening, the prisoners sat in silence again. One of them, a former Panzer engineer, spoke softly in German. "They fight differently," he said. "Not for one man, not for ideology. They fight because they believe they'll win." Another nodded, eyes still fixed on the horizon. That night in the barracks, the talk among the men changed. It was no longer about battles or the Reich's lost victories. It was about what they had seen that day. How women in uniform directed labor, how towns flourished without fear, how the lights of the factories burned all night as though the war was simply another job to be finished. Letters from home told of ruins, hunger, and despair. Yet here, even in wartime, America glowed. Its cities hummed, its trains never stopped, and its people, men and women, alike, moved with an optimism that no bomb could destroy. To the Germans lying awake in their bunks, the realization came slowly and painfully. They had been fighting a myth. The true enemy was not America's army or its generals. It was its idea, the idea of freedom, of unity, of shared strength between men and women. By midnight, the camp was silent again. Outside, the Texas wind swept across the fences, carrying faint music from a guard's radio, Bing Crosby's voice singing about a white Christmas. Inside the barracks, several prisoners closed their eyes and listened. The war felt far away now, and the world they had once believed in was crumbling. One American song, one woman's confident smile at a time. January 1945, Fort Sam Houston, Texas. Snow was falling lightly over the parade grounds as the German POWs were marched toward the infirmary compound. Their transfer orders had come through suddenly. A new group of prisoners was needed to assist with repairs and manual work at a nearby Army Medical Training Center. Most of them expected another week of shoveling or carpentry. But what they witnessed inside those gates left them utterly disarmed. Rows of barracks stretched across the field, but it wasn't the buildings that caught their attention. It was the precision and confidence of the American women moving between them. Nurses in spotless white uniforms, officers in olive drab WAC attire, technicians wheeling stretchers and medical crates. Every action carried purpose. The entire base pulsed with calm authority, and women stood at the center of it all. The German prisoners had grown up in a society that worshipped rigid hierarchy. Men led, women obeyed. Yet here, the structure was seamless. Women gave orders to enlisted men without hesitation, and the men obeyed without resentment. The discipline wasn't forced, it was earned. The POWs could see it in the way the Soldiers addressed their female superiors with respect, not fear. Inside one of the training halls, American nurses practiced battlefield surgery. The prisoners were ordered to sweep and clean after drills, but they couldn't look away. They watched as women calmly worked through simulated wounds, applying tourniquets, sterilizing instruments, and closing gashes on training mannequins. Their hands were steady, their movements practiced. When the alarm bell rang, signaling a mock air raid, they moved with military precision, checking stretchers, securing supplies, directing orderlies. One of the prisoners, formerly a medic in the Wehrmacht, froze mid-step. He watched a young American, lieutenant, a woman, explain how to treat burn victims using new, synthetic dressings, developed in U.S. labs. The technique was something he had never seen before, not even in German field hospitals. She spoke with clarity and confidence, surrounded by younger nurses who took notes like cadets in a combat briefing. That night, back in their temporary quarters, the conversation among the POWs was uneasy. Some dismissed what they had seen as propaganda. Others, the more thoughtful ones, admitted it wasn't staged. America's power, they realized, didn't come just from its factories, it came from the minds of its people. Education was not privilege here. It was expectation. Even women studied science, medicine, and engineering. It was a civilization built on shared competence. The next morning brought another shock. They were marched past an airfield where rows of P-51 Mustangs gleamed in the winter sun. Near the hangars, women in mechanics' coveralls worked on engines, replacing fuel pumps, testing hydraulics, and checking oxygen systems. One waved to a male pilot as he climbed into his plane. He saluted her before taxiing out. The Germans stopped briefly, their guards barking for them to keep moving. But that brief moment burned itself into their memory. In the Reich, a woman's place was defined by service to her husband and the Führer. Here, it was defined by skill, by knowledge, by action. Days turned into weeks. The prisoners began to understand the rhythm of American life, not through speeches or ideology, but through observation. Every supply truck arrived on time. Every hospital bed was accounted for. Every meal distributed fairly. There was no chaos, no corruption, no favoritism. The system functioned because ordinary people, many of them women, believed in it. One afternoon, a shipment of medical crates arrived from Chicago. Each box was stamped with factory labels, assembled by women of the Republic. Inside were new surgical tools, packed with precision that spoke of pride, not just duty. The POWs couldn't help but marvel. Back in Germany, the industrial system was collapsing under bombings. Here, it thrived, expanding with relentless energy. A German officer among the prisoners, once a lecturer in Berlin, wrote in his hidden diary that night, "It is a strange thing to witness the enemy's strength, not in their weapons, but in their women. They do not fight with hate, they fight with purpose. Perhaps this is why they cannot be broken." By late January, the POWs had come to a quiet conclusion among themselves. America's victory wasn't just inevitable, it was already written into its society. The Germans had believed technology alone won wars. But what they saw here shattered that illusion. True strength came from unity, from a nation that empowered all its people, even in times of destruction. When the sun set over Fort Sam Houston, the sound of distant jazz carried through the air, a radio playing. Sentimental journey. The Terry women off duty gathered by the barracks, laughing, sharing cigarettes, writing letters home. The German prisoners watched from a distance, still behind the barbed wire, yet oddly moved. There was no arrogance, no cruelty in their captors, just confidence. A quiet, unshakable belief that tomorrow would be better than today. For the first time since their capture, some of the Germans began to question everything they had ever been taught about superiority, strength, and destiny. The image of the American women, their skill, discipline, and humanity, had done what no interrogator could. It had broken the myth of the Reich from the inside. March 1945, Fort Lewis, Washington State. Cold mist rolled off the pine forests at dawn as the train carrying German prisoners screeched to a halt. Through the frost-covered windows, they could see the outlines of mountains, vast, distant, and silent. The guards shouted for them to disembark, boots striking against the frozen ground. Ahead lay another camp, another chapter in their captivity. But this place was different. It was not just a camp, it was a supply nexus for the Pacific War effort. And the heartbeat of it all was, once again, American women. As the prisoners were led toward the sprawling warehouses, the air was filled with the rhythm of machinery. Inside, women stood at conveyor belts assembling components for aircraft, engines, and field equipment. Sparks flashed from welding torches. Forklifts buzzed across the concrete floor. Every corner was alive with movement and sound. Yet it wasn't chaotic. It was choreographed precision, like a living organism. The Germans had seen American industry before, but never like this. Here, thousands of workers, many of them women in denim, coveralls with grease on their hands and scarves tied around their hair, operated the war machine with effortless command. They lifted crates, measured bolts, adjusted gauges. Some ran quality checks with the focus of engineers. Others managed logistics boards filled with pins and color-coded maps showing shipments to Pacific bases. Among them were former school teachers, housewives, and students, now transformed into the architects of victory. The men who once dismissed them as fragile now saw steel in their posture, precision in their eyes. There was no propaganda here, no staged scenes. This was real America. Industrious, determined, unstoppable. One POW named Otto, who had served as an artillery officer, stood frozen as he watched a young woman operate a heavy crane, lowering a massive aircraft engine onto a transport platform. Her movements were steady, exact. The guards noticed his stare and ordered him to keep walking, but he couldn't look away. That image of a woman commanding thousands of pounds of machinery with casual confidence burned into his mind. During the lunch break, music played softly over the loudspeakers. Glenn Miller, Moonlight Serenade. The women laughed and shared sandwiches, wiping grease from their hands with rags. Some of the male workers joined them, joking easily as equals. There was no division, no hierarchy of gender, only shared effort, shared pride. To the Germans, the atmosphere was disorienting. They were used to factories built on fear, where supervisors shouted, where mistakes meant punishment, where exhaustion was normal. But here, the energy came from something else entirely. Belief. These workers didn't dread their labor. They believed in its purpose. It was not obedience that powered them, but confidence. Later that afternoon, a Red Cross officer guided a few POWs through a hangar where completed. B-17 bomber parts were being crated for transport. On one of the wooden panels, painted in bright red letters, were the words, "Built by the Women of America." The German prisoners stood silently, staring at it. They had mocked such slogans once, calling them naive. Now it felt prophetic. One prisoner, formerly a member of the Luftwaffe, whispered under his breath, "We lost the war the day their factories learned to run without men." In the evenings, as the prisoners returned to their barracks, they could see the glow of Seattle in the distance, A by T, city alive with light despite the blackout rules. Trains rumbled through the night, carrying supplies westward. Every sound, the whistle, the hum of power lines, the echo of typewriters in the administrative buildings, spoke of a country that refused to stop. News from Europe began filtering through the camp radios. The Reich was collapsing. Bridges gone, cities burned, divisions cut off. The men listened in silence as they heard of Hitler's desperate counterattacks and failed defenses. The contrast was unbearable. Here in America, everything worked. Clean water, organized logistics, functioning railways, steady supplies. It was a civilization that had not only survived the storm, but had turned it into motion. As spring approached, the POWs were assigned to plant trees and repair fences near the training fields. Sometimes they saw military vehicles rolling past, jeeps driven by women officers, trucks filled with supplies headed for the docks. Each sight drove home the same truth. America had built an army that extended far beyond the battlefield. Its strength came not just from weapons or generals, but from every citizen willing to shoulder the load. By late March, the German prisoners no longer argued about propaganda. They had seen too much. Their letters home, carefully, censored but still revealing, carried a quiet respect for the enemy they once despised. They wrote of order, of prosperity, of a people who seemed incapable of fear. Some even wrote that defeat didn't feel like humiliation. It felt like awakening. One evening, as the camp lights dimmed and the night settled over the valley, Otto looked toward the horizon where the faint hum of aircraft echoed. "They have conquered the sky," he murmured to himself, "and everything beneath it." The war would end in a few weeks, but for the men behind the wire, the real defeat had already occurred, not on the battlefield, but in their hearts. They had witnessed a society where women built planes, drove trucks, commanded respect, and carried the strength of a nation in their hands. For them, the most powerful weapon America possessed was not its bombs or tanks. It was its people, free, fearless, and united. As the dawn rose the next morning, streaking gold across the snow-capped Cascades, the German POWs watched an American flag rise slowly over Fort Lewis. The cloth rippled in the cold wind, catching the first light of day. And for the first time, they understood what that flag truly meant. Not domination, but possibility. Not superiority, but freedom. And they could not look away. May 1945, Bremen, Germany. The train groaned to a halt beside a platform covered in ash and silence. The men inside, former prisoners of war, stared through the cracked windows at what had once been a proud city. Bremen lay in ruins. Smoke still drifted from gutted buildings. Church spires stood like broken bones against a gray sky. And the streets were empty, except for children scavenging in the rubble. For months, these men had been fed, housed, and treated with decency in the American camps. Now, they stepped back into a homeland that barely existed. Their boots crunched on shattered glass. The air smelled of dust, burned paper, and despair. And as they walked through the ruins, one truth pressed heavily in their chests. Germany had not only lost a war, it had lost its soul. Among them walked Otto, the former artillery officer, carrying the small duffel he had been issued in Fort Lewis. Inside were a few ration tins, a wool blanket, and something else, a folded piece of paper with an American slogan printed on it. "Freedom is the surest weapon." He kept it not as a souvenir, but as a reminder of what he had seen. The streets of Bremen were filled with hollow-eyed civilians. Women in tattered coats hauled water from broken pipes. Men moved bricks with bare hands. There were no trucks, no laughter, no music, only the dull rhythm of survival. In the distance, American supply convoys rolled through, distributing food and medicine. The same flag that had flown over their prison camp now fluttered on trucks, bringing bread to German children. The sight struck something deep and unfamiliar. Gratitude. Otto met an old comrade from his regiment, now limping with a cane. They shared stories quietly. His friend spoke of the front, the encirclements, the bombings, the endless retreat. Otto spoke of America. He described the women driving trucks through the Texas heat, the nurses at Fort Sam Houston commanding surgery drills with precision, the factory workers in Washington who built engines by the thousands. His friend laughed bitterly at first. "Propaganda," he said, but Otto only shook his head. "No," he answered softly. "It was truth. They don't conquer with fear. They conquer with belief." Days turned to weeks. The men tried to rebuild their lives among the ruins, but the world they had once known was gone. The Reich's promises of superiority, purity, and destiny had burned to ash. And yet, in the quiet moments, the POWs who had seen America carried a strange new perspective, a 2TE vision of what a nation could be when it valued freedom more than control. One afternoon, Otto walked past a school being reopened by the Allied authorities. A young German woman stood at the front of a line of children. distributing chalk and paper. She wore a donated coat, her hair tied back in a simple knot. For a fleeting moment, Otto thought of the American women he had seen, the ones who worked with machines, who laughed without fear, who commanded respect without violence. He paused and said to her, "Do you know what America taught me?" She looked up, puzzled. He smiled faintly. "That strength is not what we believed it was. It's not in weapons or orders or flags. It's in opportunity, in people like you." That night, as he sat among the ruins, Otto took out the paper from his duffel and unfolded it under the dim light of a candle. The American slogan seemed almost unreal against the darkness. Freedom is the surest weapon. He realized then what he and millions of others had never understood during the war. America's real victory was not just on the battlefield. It was in the idea that no nation could ever defeat a people who believed in their own potential. In Fort Lewis, he had watched women build engines that would power bombers across the Pacific. In Texas, he had seen nurses train soldiers to save lives instead of take them. In every corner of that vast country, men and women worked together as equals, bound not by fear but by purpose. And that unity had crushed everything Germany had stood for. When the sun rose over the broken city, Otto joined a group of men clearing debris from a collapsed street. The air was cold but clear. For the first time, he felt no bitterness, only understanding. He thought of those women again, their voices, their laughter, their unstoppable confidence. He could still see the dust swirling behind their trucks, the sunlight on their faces, the effortless way they carried the weight of a nation. And he knew, with complete certainty, that the war had taught him the most important lesson of his life, that the future would belong not to those who ruled by fear, but to those who inspired by freedom. He looked toward the west, toward the invisible ocean that separated him from that vast, unstoppable country. And though he would never see it again, he smiled quietly and said, almost to himself, "The sky truly belongs to them now."